Needless to add, the ethereal, lacy, floating house of worship at Wilmot does not look like a wedding cake, but Juliet had an opinion and she voiced it. Let us remember the text says that at the very root of the cause lies the principle of the undoubted right of the individual to self-expression, his freedom to declare his conscience and set forth his views. Bahá'í Administration, page 54. We read in her diary of the masters telling Juliet a thing so wonderful that she could not repeat it. In after years, she confided to Bahá'í pioneer Bill Smits what that thing was. You are nearer to me than anyone here, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá had said, because you have told me the truth. Asked what he meant by here, she said, oh, New York, the United States, I don't know.
The diary we have here is not the original, longhand one. She destroyed that. She was essentially a private person, and all those secrets have blown away. This diary is the core of the original. She kept whatever she wanted posterity to have. Sat up in bed with the portable on her knees and typed it herself. I was one of necessarily few to receive a carbon, and mine has some of her own handwritten notes in the margin. Some years afterward, I had the carbon professionally typed for the National Spiritual Assembly, but years later it could not be discovered in their files. Also, Philip Sprague mimeographed parts of it, but where that material is, we do not know.
Still, more years later, when Harold and I were back from Europe and living in New Hampshire, I became aware that with so few copies in the world, it might be lost forever. And consulting with fellow Baha'is, we had Xeroxes made so it would stay safe. Meanwhile, someone, was it Daisy, had brought out a handsome booklet printed by Roy Crofters, East Aurora, New York, entitled ʻAbdu'l-Bahā's First Days in America, from the diary of Juliet Thompson. It bears no date or copyright, is 40 pages long, and contains only excerpts, a teaser as it were. The truth seems to be that during her lifetime, the Baha'is in charge of publishing did not cotton to the diary. Too personal, they said. They probably meant that there was too much love in it. We understand this, but we note that the mass of the believers were always eager for it. Here was a woman blessed as perhaps no other Occidental Baha'i was blessed. Not only was she received by ʻAbdu'l-Bahá in the Holy Land in Switzerland and in the eastern United States, but she had an artist's eye and a writer's pen, and thus, better perhaps than any, she was able to evoke those so often irretrievable days and hours.
ʻAbdu'l-Bahá prophesied of her that in the time to come, queens will wish they had been the maid of Juliet. Certainly, she received priceless opportunities and proved adequate to her good fortune.
Love is not blind, it is quick-eyed, George Herbert said. ʻAbdu'l-Bahá likened Juliet to Mary Magdalene because she loved and saw so much. She had that same storied love that Mary had, that love which, after all, is the only thing that holds the Baha'is together, or for that matter, holds the Lord to his creatures or keeps the stars in their courses. She says here that one early morning on that breathless, ecstatic, tear-drenched pilgrimage, she gave up her will, made over her desires and her life to the will of God, and saw how, when we are able to do that, the design takes perfect shape. Then peace comes, she says, and beauty undreamed of blossoms upon our days. Again, she tells how the Master once gathered the American pilgrims together, they being symbols of all, and said he hoped that a great and ever-growing love would be established. Among them, he knew that their one main desire was to live in his presence, and he told them how this could be done.
The more, he said, you love one another, the nearer you get to me. I go away from this world, but love stays always. Juliet's death notice in the New York Times says that she was born in New York, but the jacket to her book, I, Mary Magdalene, undoubtedly more to be trusted, has her a Virginian by birth. She was a cult figure. People became possessive about her, regarded her as theirs, and only grudgingly doled her out. This was particularly true of Helen James, who came from the Caribbean area and was a long-time companion. I can remember Helen angrily barring the door to me one day when Juliet was sick. It did not bother me too much. I knew from my mythology that dragons guarded treasures. Then there was another time when I had prevailed on a man to come over to the village all the way from Brooklyn and record Juliet's voice as she read from her diary on wire. The business was new then, and Helen tried in the midst of it to break from the other room and let in even more noise, besides what was already being reproduced from the traffic on West 10th.
You can say for Helen that she was a true friend to Juliet and faithful. One midday, years after all this, as Juliet lay in her bed, it seems that she looked up at Helen and asked, "Do you want to come with me and be with ʻAbdu'l-Bahá?" "No," Helen told her, "I'm not ready yet." And then as she watched, she saw Juliet die. It was 4 December 1956. They had moved by then, the Times said, to 129 East 10th. I was glad that she did not die at number 48. The Guardian's cable received by Daisy Smith on December 7th said, "Deeply grieved and her reward assured." To the National Spiritual Assembly, he cabled, "Deplore loss," and he directed that a memorial gathering be held for her in the house of worship. In this cable, among other praises, he referred to her imperishable memory, said that she was fired with consuming devotion to the center of Baha'u'llah's covenant, and called her much loved, greatly admired, outstanding, exemplary handmaid of ʻAbdu'l-Bahá.
'48 West 10th Street was a house dedicated to ʻAbdu'l-Bahá. Often when you were let in the front door, you heard his voice, the recorded, spontaneous chant made in 1912 loudly. One day, Juliet took Robert Gulick and me up the street to the corner of Fifth Avenue, and we entered the beautiful church of the Ascension that had once been Percy Grant's pride before his ruin. And she showed us exactly where ʻAbdu'l-Bahá stood, delivering his first American public address on 14 April 1912. He came out of the vestry on the right, just as the choir burst into Jesus' lives. He sat in the bishop's chair, which broke the 19th canon of the church for the Unbaptized may not go behind the chancel rail. The red plush chair with its high back was still there, just as it had been that other day, although no flame burned on the altar then. When he spoke, as you looked past the low steps to the altar, he was on the right, and he stood on the fifth flagstone.
ʻAbdu'l-Bahá had told Juliet she must either break with Percy Grant or marry him. She'd broken with him. Percy had arranged this meeting for the master as a peace offering to Juliet. From this very pulpit, to win Juliet away from her faith, he had often inveighed against the decadent East, had even denounced the Bahá'í sect. But today, he had filled the church with lilies and arranged for one from the East and head of the Baha'is to speak. Juliet said that she used in her story of Mary Magdalene, whom, as ʻAbdu'l-Bahá remarked in the diary, she even physically resembled, many things she learned from the Master himself. This book has inclined many a heart toward our faith, and Stanwood Cobb considered it one of the most graphic and lofty delineations of Christ ever made in literature.
She illustrated her story with portraits, 3 of them, one hallowed of the Master's face. Mary wears Juliet's face, they being look-alikes, and the handsome lover, Novatus, wears the face of Percy Grant. She was a serious artist, frequently exhibited, and a member of the National Arts Club. She had studied at the Corcoran Art School, then at Juilliard's in Paris, and with Kenneth Hayes Miller in New York.
During the Coolidge era, Juliet's beauty and social background, along with her artistic gifts, carried her into the White House. It is interesting to note how many Baha'is have been received at the White House, all the way from Ali Kuli Khan in Florence and Laura Barney in the early days to moderns like Robert Hayden and Dizzy Gillespie. Juliet was there to make a portrait of Mrs. Coolidge, incidentally one of the most popular of first ladies. The president came in to watch, said Juliet, chewing on an apple, and I told Mrs. Coolidge I could not put up with that. The portrait she did of ʻAbdu'l-Bahá described here in the diary no longer exists except in a photograph. Time damaged, it had to be restored, and Juliet felt the original was gone forever. The Kennys maintained that he did like it because he said it made him look old. ʻAbdu'l-Bahá greatly encouraged her art and told her it was the same as worship, but toward the end she no longer cared to go on with it, nor even cared for her once loved New York as it had become, and all she wanted to do was teach the faith.
Sometimes Juliet and Marjorie would recline at the top of Juliet's large bed, while Daisy and I would sit on chairs at the foot. The steady warm spring air would blow in from the little back garden, down where Rebecca, a statue picked up by Romian Benjamin, stood scanning the horizon, endlessly waiting on her pedestal, left hand to brow. It was one such time when the conversation centered on Percy Grant, that dramatic preacher who, in our view, certainly merits a biographer, not only for his small role in our faith, but because he represents so much of New York history at this century's turn.
Poor Julie, how long did you love him? I asked. 17 years, darn it. In those days it went without saying that the love was platonic. And that is how, reinforced by Marjorie, Juliet told me how things turned out for Percy Grant. Significantly, his end is relegated in the diary to a footnote. The story of it goes like this. Grant was, as ʻAbdu'l-Bahá remarked to Ali Kuli Khan, comparing the popular society clergyman to his disadvantage with the fine Unitarian minister Howard Ives, a womanizer. Here, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá used a graphic Persian word. His remark was prompted by the fact that as they were leaving the church by a side door, they accidentally encountered the rector with a woman in his embrace. Later, the master, father to daughter, even more graphically, but in other words, warned Juliet to the same effect. And in the long run, it is of note that finally a woman toppled Grant down. She was a Cuban descended beauty of great wealth, whose luxurious car would be seen outside Grant's rectory by day and night. She had a dead white face with bright red painted lips and was a given to wearing evening gowns which did not hide the fact one breast had been completely removed, while the other remained without flaw. No intellectual, she was what Marjorie called eruditized by her association with famous artists and scholars.